This video briefly explores the life and writings of a great American author, Nathaniel Hawthorne. You will learn some key points in his biography, and you'll be able to recognize trends in his artistic sensibility in both his longer and shorter narratives. Hawthorne was born on July 4, 1804, in Salem, Massachusetts. His prominent Puritan ancestors on the Hawthorne side of the family were among the first settlers, and his mother's side, the Mannings, were tradesmen and businessmen. When Hawthorne's sea captain father died of yellow fever in 1808, his mother Elizabeth moved with her 3 children into the Manning family's commodious house in Salem. There, with his mother, sisters, grandparents, 2 aunts, and 5 uncles, Hawthorne discovered his love for reading. By his mid-teens, he was reading the British novelist of his time, all the while forming an ambition, as he wrote to his sister Elizabeth when he was 16, of becoming an author and relying for support upon his pen. At age 17, he enrolled at Bowdoin College in Brunswick, Maine, where he developed what would become lifelong friendships, one with the future President Franklin Pierce and the poet Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. 12 years later, in the prestigious North American Review, Longfellow would enthusiastically praise Hawthorne's first written volume. This volume, a collection of tales and sketches called Twice Told Tales, appeared in March 1837 and was favorably reviewed in England as well as the United States. A notebook entry written sometime in 1836 was only a little premature. In this dismal and sordid chamber, fame was won. During the time following his first success, Hawthorne may have been in love with Elizabeth Peabody, a Salem native who would become a major force in American education reform and other progressive causes. Sometime in late 1837, Hawthorne met Elizabeth's youngest sister, Sophia, a painter whose migraine headaches often made her a virtual shut-in. They were secretly engaged within a few months and then married in 1842. The Hawthornes had a total of 3 children, Una, Julian, and Rose. Fun fact, even upon marrying, Sophia did not refer to her husband by his first name. She always addressed him as Mr. Hawthorne. Newly married, the couple rented a house in Concord named the Old Manse, which was owned by Ralph Waldo Emerson's family, and they became friends with the notable writers and intellectuals of the area, including Emerson, Henry David Thoreau, and Margaret Fuller. Following the publication of Mosses from an Old Manse and The Scarlet Letter, the Hawthornes moved to Lenox, Massachusetts, in part to escape from the controversy of the content in The Scarlet Letter. In Lenox, Hawthorne developed a complicated friendship with Herman Melville, who championed Hawthorne as a great American writer in his 1850 Hawthorne and His Mosses, and dedicated Moby Dick to him. Hawthorne, over time, pulled back from Melville, and their paths seldom crossed after 1852, when the Hawthornes moved to West Newton and then back to Concord. Hawthorne was especially productive during the early 1850s. He most notably published 2 longer works. First, The House of the Seven Gables, a romance with a contemporary Salem setting, and second, The Blithedale Romance, which drew on Hawthorne's experience at Brook Farm, a hot spot for the Transcendentalist movement. After serving as a consul at Liverpool for President Pierce and after publishing several other works, the Hawthornes returned to their Concord home, which Hawthorne named The Wayside, in June 1860. Hawthorne's final years were an unhappy time for him. Una remained sickly, and Hawthorne's own health began to decline. Increasingly depressed, he tried to write, but to no avail or success. Suffering from health problems, a frail and somewhat isolated Hawthorne embarked on a trip to New Hampshire with his friend Pierce early in May 1864 and died in his sleep at a hotel later that month. He was buried in Sleepy Hollow Cemetery at Concord. Emerson and Longfellow were among his pallbearers. Still, for many, he remains tantalizingly elusive, a writer who, as he remarked in the preface to The Scarlet Letter, wished to keep the inmost me behind its veil. He was, to be sure, a deeply private man, but the elusiveness of his fiction stems from a deliberate aesthetic of ambiguity. We can view Hawthorne as a dweller in the shadows of history, weaving his art out of the haunted memories of Puritanism, but he was scarcely conscious of real life in the 19th century. Writing the social reality of his time was really not his preoccupation as an author. Instead, he became second to no historian of the long-starved New England imagination, and the brilliance of his pictures depends on the obvious devices, on the studied adjective, the prolonged antithesis, the overwhelmingly elaborate parallel. If he is a historian at all, then his fiction emblemizes and explores American character, a record of unconscious depths and an uncanny ability to recreate the past. He recovered what Puritans professed but seldom practiced, the spirit of piety, humility, and tragedy in the face of the inscrutable ways of God. For behind Hawthorne's formality, you can sense several New England generations in which language had served for public uses, for sermons and political deliberation, but scarcely at all for literature. For our purposes, let's focus on his short stories. The Hawthornian sketch embodies the full of hope, the happy, miserable, the desperate, and they all dwell together within the circle of his glance as the author. It is important to note that he does not defame the Puritans by romanticizing their adversaries. We will see this dynamic in both young Goodman Brown and in The Minister's Black Veil. What terrified Hawthorne most about the isolated individual was the cold inability to respond to ordinary life, whether it had dehumanized him and involved him in a self-conscious battening on others' lives. We will see this terror exemplified in The Birthmark. Think about the following quote by Melville while reading Hawthorne's short stories this week. "Truth often finds its way to the mind close muffled in robes of sleep, and then speaks with uncompromising directness of matters in regard to which we practice an unconscious self-deception during our waking moments." Yes, this quote is just as confusing as it reads, but I like for students to be aware of this quote and try to dissect this quote or analyze it because it's important to both Herman Melville's and Nathaniel Hawthorne's aesthetic. They dig into the unconscious mind in order to find truth, and that journey to truth is going to be very confusing and uncompromising, and it will often lead to self-deception for the characters. What's most important to note about Hawthorne's aesthetic in general is that it's a product of a passionate imagination that transforms the mechanical horrors of the Gothic into something really felt for the reader through the page, as he explored a mysterious borderland of fantasy and reality. This ability to take the stock trappings of romanticism that we've learned, but to endow them with genuine horror of tortured nerves, has been a peculiarly American combination, one that is present in Poe's work, of course, but in the future with Ambrose Bierce and William Faulkner. In 1879, the author Henry James called Nathaniel Hawthorne the most valuable example of American genius, expressing the widely held belief that he was the most significant fiction writer of the antebellum period. Readers continue to celebrate Hawthorne for his prose style, his perceptive renderings of New England history, his astute understanding of the human psyche, and his vivid characterizations, especially those of his female characters like Hester Prynne in The Scarlet Letter. As a result, he never imposed a single moral on any of his stories. He often withheld his thoughts or offered multiple and conflicting interpretations, but in doing so, Hawthorne allots agency to readers to do their own interpretive work. But in that way, interpretation becomes a form of self-expression.